She was 25 and had been made homeless by a quiet word. With no family left, no work, and no plan, she had only the clothes she wore, a small, carved bird in her pocket, and the $2 silver she had earned scrubbing floors for the church. And with that, she bought a splintered wagon no one would touch at a sheriff's auction on the dusty edge of town. But what nobody in Redemption, Dakota Territory, knew was that the wagon's warped floorboards hid a secret that would change not only her life, but the town's, forever. If you've ever found strength in a place others deemed worthless, settle in and stay close. We love to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Ruth Carver's life had been shaped by the grain of wood and the weight of water. Her father, John Carver, had been a carpenter, a man who spoke more to timber than to people, and he had taught her the language. He taught her the difference between the tight, resilient grain of oak and the soft give of pine, how to read the history of a tree and its knots and scars. He'd taught her the names of tools not as a lesson, but as a conversation, the draw knife that peeled back bark in long, fragrant curls, the satisfying heft of a mortising axe, the fine, dusty work of a smoothing plane. Before the fever took him when she was 16, he had pressed a small, perfect wren, carved from a scrap of maple, into her hand. It was no bigger than her thumb, its tail cocked, its tiny eye a speck of drilled shadow. It was the only thing of his she had left, and it lived in the pocket of her apron, its smooth, worn surface a constant, silent comfort. Her mother had passed years before that, a ghost of memory tied to the scent of baking bread and the hum of a lullaby. With both gone, Ruth was left with her father's practical knowledge and a profound solitude. She found work where a strong back and a tolerance for anonymity were the primary qualifications. She became a laundress. For 9 years, she lived in the steam and scald of other people's lives, her hands perpetually chapped by lye, her world defined by the repetitive rhythm of scrubbing, wringing, and folding. She worked for the handful of prosperous families in the small town of Redemption, including its most powerful man, the banker Silas Croft. She was good at her work, quiet and invisible, a fixture as reliable as the weekly church service, and in her quiet way, she had believed this diligence was a form of security. The ejection, when it came, was as quiet and bloodless as a line drawn in a ledger. It happened not on a dusty street, but in the hushed, carpeted confines of Silas Croft's office at the back of the bank. The room smelled of leather and cigar smoke, a world away from the lie and steam that defined her own. Mr. Croft, a man whose round, soft face belied a flint-hard core, did not raise his voice. He sat behind his enormous mahogany desk and explained the situation as if he were discussing the weather. An examiner from the territorial capital was due to arrive, a standard but thorough review of the bank's accounts. There was a small discrepancy, he said, a matter of a payment that needed a corresponding receipt for services rendered. He slid a piece of paper across the polished wood. It was a receipt for $80, made out to her, Ruth Carver, for specialized cleaning and fabric restoration services on behalf of a mining concern she had never heard of. Her signature was all that was required. $80 was more than she earned in half a year. It was a sum that could buy a small plot of land, a fresh start, a life beyond other people's dirty linen. She looked at the paper, at the elegant script, and the damning blank line at the bottom. She thought of her father, who had once spent a week redoing a set of cabinet doors because the joinery was off by a fraction of an inch, visible only to him. It must be true, he had told her, running his hand over the perfect seam. Even if no one else sees it, you know. Ruth looked from the paper to Mr. Croft's expectant face. "I can't sign it, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but clear in the silent room. His smile did not fade, but it tightened at the corners. He offered her $10 in cash to sign. She shook her head. He pushed a stack of $20 across the desk. Again, she refused. The smile vanished. "Very well, Miss Carver," he said, his tone turning cool and administrative. It seems your services are no longer required." He leaned back in his chair. "And I feel it is my duty to inform my associates, Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Pruitt among them, that I have found your work to be unsatisfactory. It would be best if you collected your things from the boarding house by noon. My cousin owns it, you know. He prefers tenants of good character." There was no argument. There was no plea. The judgment was absolute. Ruth simply nodded, turned, and walked out of the office, the scent of leather clinging to her clothes. She gathered her few possessions, a change of dress, her father's carving knife, a bar of soap. And by the time the midday sun was high, she was standing on the main street of Redemption, with a small cloth bag, the wooden wren in her pocket, and $2 silver that suddenly felt as heavy as millstones. Her journey was not one of miles, but of steps that measured the fraying of her entire world. She walked from the boarding house, down the single dusty street that constituted the heart of Redemption, a town whose name felt like a bitter joke. The walk, which she had made 1,000 times, was now alien territory. The familiar false-fronted buildings, the general store, the land office, the saloon, seemed to lean away from her. She saw Mrs. Gable, whose children's clothes she had mended just last week, hurry across the street to avoid her path, her face a mask of determined indifference. A man tipping his hat to a neighbor looked straight through Ruth, as if she were a pane of glass. The banker's word had traveled faster than a prairie fire, and it had consumed her place in the world just as completely. She felt the sun beating on the crown of her head, the fine alkali dust coating her worn boots and the hem of her skirt. The town was small, but the social distance she was traversing was immense. With each step, she was moving from being a person, albeit a quiet one, to being a problem, a piece of refuse to be ignored. Her fatigue was bone-deep, a weariness that had little to do with the physical act of walking and everything to do with the sudden crushing weight of being utterly alone. The wooden wren in her pocket felt small and insufficient against the vastness of the prairie sky that opened up at the end of the street. She kept walking, past the last house, past the blacksmith's forge that rang with a steady, indifferent rhythm. Ahead, on a patch of sun-scorched earth near the town's meager corrals, a small group of men had gathered. It was the sheriff's auction, a periodic clearing out of unclaimed property, livestock, and the sad remnants of lives that had failed. It was a place of endings, and she walked toward it because it was the only place left to go. The auction was winding down, a desultory affair under the flat, unforgiving sun. Sheriff Elias Vance, a man whose posture seemed permanently stooped by the compromises of his office, was trying to offload the last and least desirable item. It was the wreck of a prairie schooner, not one of the grand Conestoga wagons, but a smaller, humbler farm wagon that had clearly been abandoned for years. Its canvas cover was long gone, rotted away to a few pathetic shreds clinging to the splintered hoops. The pine sideboards were bleached gray and cracked, one of them hanging loose from its iron fittings. A rear wheel was canted at a sickening angle, its hub split and several spokes missing. It smelled of decay, of mice and rain, and the slow, inexorable return of wood to dust. "All right, folks, last item," the sheriff called out, his voice tired. "Let's get this cleared. What am I bid for this wagon?" "Frame is solid oak, could be salvaged." A few of the men chuckled. One of Croft's clerks, a thin man named Peters, who had been sent to observe the proceedings, let out a derisive snort. "You'd have to pay someone to haul it away, Sheriff," someone called from the back. $5 to start?" Vance asked, his gaze sweeping the sparse crowd. He was met with silence. 3? More silence. He sighed, wiping a trickle of sweat from his temple. $2. $2, and it's yours. Final offer. From the edge of the group, Ruth stepped forward. The men turned, their expressions a mixture of surprise and pity. She ignored them, her eyes fixed on the wagon. Beneath the splintered pine and the rust, she saw what her father had taught her to see. She saw the dark, tight grain of the undercarriage timbers, seasoned by years of sun and wind until they were hard as iron. She saw the heavy, hand-forged braces, rusted but thick and true. She saw not a wreck, but a foundation. $2, she said, her voice clear and steady. A murmur went through the small crowd. Peters, the banker's man, stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Sheriff Vance looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then nodded. Sold to Miss Carver for $2. He didn't question it. He simply took the 2 heavy silver coins from her palm, his fingers brushing hers for a brief second. She was now the owner of a broken thing no one else wanted. It was a shelter, or the beginning of one. It was hers. To move the wagon was impossible without repairing the wheel, and for that, she needed help. Ruth knew of only one man in Redemption who possessed the skill, and was likely desperate enough to work for a promise instead of cash: Tom Hollis, the wheelwright. Tom was a widower whose life had fractured 2 years prior when a set of wheels he'd made for a freight company failed on a mountain pass, costing the company a valuable cargo. Though the fault was with the freighter for overloading the wagon, Tom's reputation was ruined. He now lived a solitary life in his workshop at the edge of town, taking on small mending jobs, his skill overshadowed by a cloud of perceived failure. Ruth found him planing a new spoke, the scent of hickory shavings sharp in the air. He was a tall, spare man in his late 30s, with hands that seemed too large and calloused for such delicate work. He listened to her proposal without looking up from his bench. She wanted him to repair the wheel and help her move the wagon to the small, unclaimed parcel of county land just beyond the town limit. In exchange, once she was established, she would do his washing and mending for a year. He finished shaving the spoke, tested its fit against a hub, and finally turned his gray eyes on her. He saw not a beggar, but a woman with a practical, if daunting, plan. He looked past her and saw the wagon, and like her, he recognized the quality of the bones beneath the decay. "All right," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. Tomorrow morning, the next day, they set to work. Tom, with a quiet competence that belied his reputation, showed her how to knock the iron tire from the broken wheel and assess the damage to the hub. While he began the precise work of fitting new spokes, he tasked her with clearing the wagon bed. The floor was a mess of warped, splintered planks, thick with dirt and old leaves. Using a heavy pry bar that had been her father's, Ruth began to lever them up. One plank, near the front, resisted. It was swollen tight, but it also felt different, less springy. She worked the end of the bar into a crack and put her weight into it. It came up with a groan of stressed nails, and she saw what lay beneath. It was not the wagon's main frame. It was a sheet of dark, oiled canvas, stretched taut. Her heart gave a strange, quiet thump. She looked over at Tom, who was intent on his work, and then back at the canvas. Her fingers, trembling slightly, pulled at a corner. It peeled back to reveal a shallow, hidden compartment, a false floor no more than 4 inches deep but running the full length of the wagon bed. The air that rose from it was stale, smelling of paper and leather and something else, something faintly metallic and sad. Inside, packed with a desperate neatness, were 3 oilcloth-wrapped parcels and a small, plain wooden box. She lifted the first parcel. It was heavy, rectangular. Unwrapping it, she found 2 thick ledgers, their leather covers embossed with the words Miller Milling and Timber. She set them aside and reached for the wooden box. The lid was not latched. She lifted it. Nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton was a pair of small, sturdy boys' shoes and a pair of tiny girls' boots, the leather scuffed at the toes. On one of the little boots was a dark, unmistakable stain. Her breath caught in her throat. Finally, she lifted the last parcel. It was a bundle of letters, dozens of them, tied with a piece of simple twine. On top of the stack was a single, folded sheet of paper, a letter in itself, the faded ink addressed not to a person, but to a prayer, to a finder with a good heart. That night, Inside the fragile shelter of the broken wagon, Ruth lit a small lantern and began to read. The world outside fell away, replaced by the careful sloping handwriting of a woman named Eleanor Miller. The letters, written to a sister in Ohio over the course of a year, chronicled a story of hope curdling into fear. The Millers, Eleanor, her husband Jacob, and their two small children, Samuel and Clara, had arrived in redemption with their life savings, intending to build a grist mill on the creek north of town. They were hard-working, honest people who had entrusted their capital to the town's only banker, Silas Croft. At first, the letters were full of optimism. Jacob was clearing the land. The people seemed friendly. Their banker was a pillar of the community. Then the tone began to shift. The funds for lumber and equipment, held by Croft, were dispersed slowly, always with unexpected fees and administrative costs. A survey Croft had arranged showed a boundary dispute, requiring a costly legal filing he handled for a steep price. Piece by piece, the letters painted a devastating picture of methodical theft, all of it cloaked in the legitimacy of banking paperwork. Jacob, a proud and trusting man, had begun to suspect. He had started his own ledger, cross-referencing Croft's statements with his own records of work and materials. The two ledgers now sitting beside Ruth on the wagon floor were the proof. The final letters were frantic, written in a shaky hand. Jacob had confronted Croft with his evidence. The banker had been calm, dismissive, but the next day, two grim-faced men had appeared at the Millers' camp, telling them they were trespassing and had one day to leave the territory. Eleanor, sensing a terrible finality, had packed the ledgers and her letters into the false bottom of their wagon, a secret compartment Jacob had built for valuables on the journey west. The last letter ended abruptly. "They are coming back for us. I do not know where they mean to take us. I have put the children's good shoes in the box, in case we have to walk far. May God have mercy on us." There were no more letters. The bloodstain on little Clara's boot told the rest of the story. As Ruth sat in the silent dark with this terrible knowledge, the rebuilding began, not just of the wagon, but of a buried truth. Tom Hollis, returning the next morning, found her not defeated but filled with a cold, hard purpose. He saw the ledgers on the floor, the children's shoes placed carefully to one side. She explained what she had found, her voice low and even. He listened, his face grim, and when she was finished, he simply picked up his hammer. "Let's get this floor fixed right," he said. The work became their shared language. He taught her how to select the best seasoned oak from his own dwindling supply, how to measure and cut the planks for a perfect fit. They worked in tandem, the rhythmic rasp of the saw and the steady tapping of the hammer a counterpoint to the ugly secret they now held. Tom showed her how to steam and bend new hickory hoops for the canvas cover, the wood groaning as it took its new shape, a sound like a memory being forced into the light. Craft became a form of justice. Every nail driven home was an act of defiance. Every perfectly fitted plank was a testament to the truth, covering the hollow space where the evidence had lain in wait. The wagon, under their patient hands, began to transform from a wreck into a refuge. Tom helped her secure a large sheet of heavy canvas, and together they stretched it over the newly bent hoops, pulling it taut and fastening it down. It shed the next rain perfectly, the water drumming a steady, comforting rhythm on the tight fabric. Her new home was small, no bigger than a large closet, but it was dry and it was hers. The work forged a bond between them, a quiet partnership built on shared labor and mutual respect. But their work did not go unnoticed, and soon they were no longer alone. The town blacksmith, a burly German immigrant named Karl Schmidt, whose forge was down the road, had been watching their progress. He was a man who respected honest work and had no love for the banker. One afternoon, he appeared at the wagon, carrying the rusted iron fittings from the original sideboards. He had heated them in his forge until they glowed cherry red, hammered them straight on his anvil, and quenched them, black and strong again. "A good frame needs good iron," he said, his accent thick. He refused any payment beyond a future promise of mended shirts. A few days later, Martha Gable, the same woman who had hurried away from Ruth on the street, appeared with a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. She was the wife of the general store owner and a woman who had long chafed under the social dominion of the banker's wife. She placed the bundle on the wagon steps without a word. Inside was a fresh loaf of bread, a slab of salt pork, and a small bag of coffee. The next week, she came again. It became a ritual, a silent offering of support that spoke louder than any declaration. Ruth, for her part, began to rebuild her own livelihood. Using a heavy iron pot and a fire pit Tom helped her build, she set up a small laundry operation. She couldn't compete for the business of the wealthy families, but she offered her services to the wives of laborers and farmhands, women who could not afford the main town laundress. She charged less, and her work was meticulous. Soon, a small but steady stream of women were making their way to the edge of town, their arms full of washing. They would speak in low tones, sharing news and worries as Ruth worked. The wagon was no longer an outcast's hovel. It was becoming a node in a different kind of community, one that existed in the shadow of the town's official power structure. People began to refer to the place not as the old wreck, but as Ruth's. She had a place, and she had a name again. She and Tom knew the ledgers were a weapon that had to be used carefully. The local sheriff was too deeply in Croft's pocket to be trusted. Their chance, Tom advised, would come with the circuit judge, due to arrive in a month. Until then, they would wait, and they would build. The community that settled around the wagon was one of quiet gestures and shared purpose. It was a society of the overlooked, drawn together by a common distrust of the town's polished facade. Carl, the blacksmith, would stop by on his way home, not to talk, but to check the ironwork on the wagon, tapping a brace with his hammer and nodding in satisfaction. Martha Gable's weekly offerings continued, sometimes supplemented with a jar of preserves or a few potatoes from her garden. Her husband, a timid man named Arthur, began to set aside slightly damaged goods for Ruth at the store. A dented can of peaches, a bag of flour with a small tear, selling them to her for a penny. Tom Hollis was a near-constant presence. The work on the wagon was long finished, but he found other reasons to be there. He built her a sturdy set of steps, a small fold-down table, a secure wood box. His own business began to revive as people saw the quality of his work on Ruth's wagon. Farmers who had once passed him by now stopped to ask about a new wheel or a repaired axle. His workshop, once silent, was again filled with the scent of cut wood and the sounds of labor. He and Ruth fell into an easy companionship, often sharing a simple supper of bread and stew by her fire pit as dusk settled over the prairie. Inside the wagon, Ruth had made a home. She had sewn curtains for the small opening at the back, and her father's carving knife lay on a shelf next to a tin cup holding a spray of wild asters. The wagon was no longer just a shelter. It was a living place, warm and functional, filled with the purpose she had given it. The day the circuit judge, a formidable man named Isaac Blackwood, arrived in Redemption, a quiet plan was set in motion. The official courthouse was the town hall, but Judge Blackwood, who disliked ceremony, often heard petitions and smaller cases in the saloon, finding its open nature more conducive to plain speaking. Tom, who had once done work for the judge, secured them a hearing. That afternoon, Ruth walked into the saloon, not as a laundress or an outcast, but as a citizen with a claim. She carried the Miller family's ledgers. Tom was at her side, and behind them, forming a silent, solid wall of support, were Carl the blacksmith, Arthur Gable from the store, and a half-dozen of the women whose laundry she now washed. Silas Croft was there, seated at a table with Sheriff Vance, a look of smug annoyance on his face. He watched as Ruth approached the judge's makeshift bench. She did not speak. She simply placed the two ledgers before Judge Blackwood, and beside them, the small, scuffed shoes of Samuel and Clara Miller. The truth, buried for years under a false floor and a town's willful silence, was finally brought into the light. The judge opened the first ledger. The saloon, usually a place of rowdy noise, fell into a profound silence, broken only by the rustle of turning pages. Judge Blackwood was a man known for his thoroughness, and he examined Jacob Miller's careful entries, then Silas Croft's official bank ledger, his brow furrowing as he compared the two. The pattern was undeniable, a slow, systematic siphoning of funds through inflated fees, phantom charges, and fraudulent transactions. The evidence was not merely an accusation, it was a meticulous, dated record of a crime. When he finished, he looked up, not at Croft, but at Ruth. "Where did you find these, Miss Carver?" he asked, his voice grave. Ruth explained, simply and without embellishment, about the $2 wagon and the false floor. She told him about the letters from Eleanor Miller, and then, her voice faltering for the first time, she pointed to the small shoes on the table. "They were in there too," she said. The judge picked up the little girl's boot and saw the dark stain. A wave of quiet horror moved through the room. He turned his gaze, cold as a winter morning, upon Silas Croft. The banker's face had gone pale, his composure finally cracking. He started to bluster, to speak of disgruntled clients and fabricated evidence, but the judge cut him off with a sharp rap of his gavel on the table. He called Sheriff Vance forward and ordered him to place Croft under arrest for theft and to open an investigation into the disappearance of the Miller family. Vance, his face ashen as he saw his own complicity about to be exposed, hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying. The power that had held redemption in its grip for years had been broken not by a gunfight, but by a woman with a pry bar and the truth. In the weeks that followed, the town remade itself. Croft's assets were seized, and the territorial marshal arrived to conduct a full inquiry. The bodies of Jacob and Eleanor Miller were found in a shallow grave on the land Croft had stolen from them. He and the two men who had acted as his enforcers were tried and sentenced to hang. The town, cleansed of its long-held poison, began to breathe again. Tom Hollis, his reputation fully restored, was commissioned to build 3 new freight wagons for the company that had once shunned him. He offered Ruth a partnership, not just in business, but in life. One cool evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Ruth sat on the steps of her wagon home. A thin curl of smoke rose from the small stovepipe Tom had installed. He sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching, sharing a mug of hot coffee. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Inside the wagon, on the small shelf she had built, the little wooden wren her father had carved sat beside the cleaned and polished shoes of the Miller children. One was an object of love given, the other an object of love lost, and together they formed a testament to lives that mattered. She looked out over the vast, quiet prairie at the town of Redemption in the distance, no longer a place of exile, but a community she had helped to heal. Ruth Carver was 25 and had been penniless. She had $2 to her name, and she had spent it on a broken wagon that no one else would touch. It was the best $2 she ever spent. We believe that strength is often found in the places and people that others have written off. If this story of quiet courage found a place in your heart, we hope you'll subscribe and share it with someone who might need it. We'll be back soon with another story. Until then, let us know in the comments below, what is something of value that you have built from a thing that someone else had thrown away?